Hey everyone, I know a lot of you out there are feeling a little unsure right now about the U.S. economy
Mm.
and just, like global markets in general.
Right.
And you're definitely not alone in that. You've sent over some seriously interesting stuff recently, articles about Trump's policies, some news on gold prices hitting like record highs, and even some thoughts on what's happening with the UK economy.
Yeah.
So
hmm
let's just like dive into it all.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, this idea of American exceptionalism and how it seems to be getting challenged, especially with like Chinese AI coming up and what it all means for us, for our own finances and investments and stuff.
It's interesting you say that about American exceptionalism, because for a long time it's been like a core assumption in economics globally. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think we're definitely at a point where that assumption is being questioned more and more.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And some of the things you sent in actually point to Trump's policies as, potential causes for this uncertainty,
Yeah.
like the tariffs and deportations and things like that.
Mm.
One commentator, Katie Martin, even said that Trump seems to judge his success by, like, how well the stock market is doing,
Right.
which, creates this really reactive and volatile environment.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think there's definitely some truth to that. We've seen how quickly markets can react to just like one tweet or
Mm.
one announcement from the White House. And that kind of unpredictability, well, it makes it hard for businesses to plan, for investors to feel confident.
Sure.
But it's important to remember, too, that the U.S. economy, it's not like an island. It's super interconnected with the global economy. And what happens in the U.S., it ripples out all over the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the articles you sent me mentioned the UK bond market recently.
Yeah.
It had this like little wobble, and apparently it was partly triggered by uncertainty about U.S. economic policy.
Right.
It's kind of crazy how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, it is. And that brings us to another thing that's like shaking things up. Chinese AI.
Oh, yeah?
Specifically, you sent me some news about DeepSeek. It's this Chinese-developed AI that's supposed to be like cheaper, more energy efficient, and some even say it beats ChatGPT. What I found really interesting was that they developed DeepSeek for way less money than the U.S. counterparts.
Right.
Like, we're talking $5 million compared to billions.
Yeah, it is wild when you think about it. If they could do that, achieve those kind of results with such a lean approach, what does that say about the future of AI development?
Right.
Will it, move away from that big budget Silicon Valley model?
It's definitely possible. I mean, DeepSeek's success has definitely sent like shockwaves through the tech industry. Those big U.S. tech companies, the Magnificent Seven, as some people call them.
Yeah.
Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Tesla, and NVIDIA.
Right.
Well, they make up a huge part of the S&P 500, and their dominance is being challenged. Like NVIDIA, for example, is a $3 trillion company. It specializes in those, high-powered chips needed for AI. If Chinese AI can get similar results, maybe even better, with less expensive, less energy-intensive tech, well, that could have some serious consequences.
Totally. And it makes me wonder about the implications for, like, energy, too. If
Huh.
Chinese AI doesn't need as much energy infrastructure, wouldn't that potentially, lead to a decrease in demand for U.S. energy stocks?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. I mean, the energy sector is already facing a ton of uncertainty, as the world is moving towards cleaner energy sources. And then the rise of Chinese AI with potentially, lower energy demands could really shake things up even more. But it's also important to remember that this isn't just some, a story about China taking over from the U.S. It's also a chance for other countries, maybe even the U.K., to get in on the action, to develop their own AI solutions that can compete.
Right. So we've got all this uncertainty with what's happening in the U.S., and now China is making big moves in AI. But let's circle back to the U.S. economy itself. Is it really as strong as everyone thinks? Or is there, more fragility there than we realize? Katie Martin, the commentator we mentioned earlier, she actually compared the U.S. economy to, like, gooey pudding.
Oh, wow.
What do you think about that analogy?
Well, I think she's trying to say that while the U.S. economy still has a lot of, influence and weight, there are some underlying weaknesses that might not be so obvious at first.
Right.
And a lot of that comes back to the uncertainty around Trump's policies, which we've already talked about a bit.
Yeah.
But it's worth, taking a closer look at some of those policies because they could really impact everything from inflation to the job market.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. Let's
Yeah.
start with the tariffs. What are the real-world effects of those?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people seem to think that tariffs are just like punishing the other country, but it's not that simple, right?
No, not at all. It's a common misconception that tariffs force the other country to pay. But the reality is that a lot of times those costs just get passed on to us, the consumers.
Right.
So what happens is you see higher prices on things that are imported, and that can definitely contribute to inflation.
Makes sense. And then there's the deportations.
Hmm.
I'm curious about, how that could affect the U.S. labor market and wages and stuff.
That's a really complicated issue, but large-scale deportations, well, they could lead to labor shortages, especially in industries that really rely on immigrant labor.
Okay.
And those shortages could then cause wages to go up, which, could push inflation up even more.
Right.
So you can see how these policies, which might seem totally unrelated at first glance, can actually have this like domino effect on the economy.
It sounds like we've got a lot of things happening right now, both here in the U.S. and globally with like this whole Chinese AI thing.
Yeah, a lot to consider.
Given all this uncertainty, how should people be thinking about their investments?
Right.
Should they be sticking with U.S. markets or like diversify globally?
Mm-hmm.
And what about this whole passive versus active investing debate?
Those are the questions a lot of people are asking right now. I mean, diversifying globally is definitely a way to spread risk, especially when you consider that markets don't always move in the same direction.
Uh-huh.
One of your sources mentioned how the UK is actually shrinking as a percentage of global indexes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that could mean that there are, opportunities popping up in other markets that people might overlooked before.
That makes a lot of sense, like looking beyond what we're used to, especially with everything changing so fast.
Yeah.
But what about this whole passive versus active investing thing? I hear, people saying all sorts of things about it.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic. Passive investing is basically about putting your money in index funds that, you know, track a specific market like the S&P 500. So
Hmm.
you're not trying to pick individual stocks or anything. You're just going with the overall flow of the market.
Okay.
Active investing, on the other hand, is more about trying to beat the market. Like you're picking specific stocks that you think will do better than the rest.
Right.
It takes a lot more research, more time, and honestly, a bit of luck.
So it's kind of like trying to, outperform elite athletes.
Exactly.
You mentioned that analogy earlier, and it's a good one. Like, most of us wouldn't think we could beat Usain Bolt in a race,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in the same way, most people who aren't professional investors probably shouldn't expect to consistently do better than the experts, the fund managers.
Yeah. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's a tough game. And even the pros, even the professional fund managers, they often struggle to beat the market consistently.
Oh.
So for most people, sticking with a passive approach and diversifying their investments is a pretty solid strategy. But you got to remember, no investment strategy is perfect. The key is to have a plan, stick with it, and not freak out when the market goes up and down, because it will.
That sounds like good advice.
Yeah.
But it's hard to ignore those headlines. The news is constantly throwing stuff at us: trade wars, economic uncertainty, AI taking over the world.
Mm.
I know people are feeling anxious about all of it.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to those who are, feeling overwhelmed by all the economic jargon and the conflicting information?
I'd say, first of all, you're not alone. It's a lot to digest, and it's easy to get caught up in the fear and hype. The best thing you can do is focus on what you can actually control.
Okay.
Make sure you've got a solid financial base. That means like an emergency fund contributing to your retirement savings and managing your debt responsibly. Those are the basics, and they'll help you get through anything.
So it's about taking control of your finances and not letting the market mess with your head.
Right.
But I also can't help but think about the bigger picture. We've always seen the U.S. as the leader in, technology and innovation.
Hmm.
If that leadership is being challenged, what does that mean for everyone else?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that a lot of experts are trying to figure out right now.
Yeah.
It could lead to a world where, technological advancements and economic power are more spread out. Maybe that'll create more competition. And that could actually push innovation globally. It might not be a bad thing.
But couldn't that also, potentially lead to more uncertainty and conflict,
Mm-hmm.
especially with how things are politically right now?
There's always a chance of instability when the balance of power shifts, but history is full of surprises.
True.
We can't predict the future, for sure. This whole rise of Chinese AI, it could actually push the U.S. to, put more into its own tech development, and that could lead to even more breakthroughs. It's too early to say what the long-term impact will be.
Okay, so maybe it's not all doom and gloom. It's more about understanding that the landscape is changing
Mm.
and adapting to those changes. We were talking about investment strategies earlier, and I know one of the things you said, I mentioned that gold has been hitting record highs lately.
Yeah.
That's been driven by, all this trade tension and economic uncertainty. Is gold a safe haven in times like these, or is it just a speculative bubble?
Well, gold has always been seen as kind of a hedge against inflation and economic turmoil, and this recent surge is definitely being fueled by those concerns about, where the global economy is heading and all the anxieties around U.S. policy.
So would you say it's a smart investment right now?
It really depends on your own, risk tolerance and what you're trying to achieve with your investments. Gold can be really volatile and its price can swing up and down pretty unpredictably. I think the important thing is to do your research, understand the risks involved before you make any decisions, whether it's gold, stocks, or anything else.
Always good advice. One more thing I wanted to touch on is the UK.
Okay.
We talked earlier about how the UK economy is connected to what's happening in the US, but how is all this US-centric drama impacting the British economy and its markets specifically?
Well, the UK is in a kind of unique spot. They're not as reliant on exports as some other countries, but Brexit, has created its own set of challenges,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to business investment.
Right.
There's a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds for the UK economy, and you can see that reflected in the markets.
Yeah, Brexit definitely threw a wrench in the works. It's interesting, though, because despite all that, the UK stock market actually hit a record high recently. How do you make sense of that?
It definitely shows some resilience, that's for sure. But I also think it highlights how markets can sometimes move in ways that don't really reflect what's happening in people's everyday lives.
Right.
Just because the stock market is doing well doesn't mean everyone is benefiting from it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that brings us back to why it's so important to look beyond the headlines and really understand what's driving the economy.
Yeah.
It's not just about numbers and charts. It's about people, policies,
Yeah.
and all these complex global events that all tie together.
It's about, connecting those dots and understanding that these economic trends aren't just these abstract concepts. They have real consequences for people, businesses, and whole countries even.
Yeah, definitely. And we've covered a lot in this deep dive,
We have.
from Trump's policies to, the rise of Chinese AI, the UK situation, and how all of it could affect our investments.
Right.
So what would you say is like the key takeaway for everyone listening today?
Well, I think the main thing is that things are changing globally.
Okay.
The global economic landscape is shifting. The U.S. economy is still a big player, obviously, but it's facing some real challenges to its, top dog status.
Yeah.
And that creates a lot of uncertainty for all of us.
For sure. So buckle up, I guess,
Yeah.
right? Besides staying informed and diversifying our investments,
hmm
what else can people do to, deal with all this uncertainty?
I think the most important thing is to stay flexible, Be ready to adapt. Don't be afraid to adjust your strategies as things change. And remember, no one has all the answers.
Uh,
Be wary of anyone who says they can predict the future because the reality is the future is always uncertain.
that's so true.
Mm.
It's about being prepared to adapt rather than trying to guess what's going to happen. And I think that's true for more than just investing. It's about being adaptable in every part of our lives as the world keeps changing around us.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up here, I want to leave everyone with something to think about. We've talked a lot about the potential downsides of U.S. dominance being challenged, but what if we looked at it differently? What about the potential benefits of a more, multipolar world? A world where innovation and economic power are more spread out? Could that lead to more collaboration and progress on, global issues like climate change or poverty?
That's a really interesting question to think about. It's a reminder that change, even though it can be scary, can also bring new opportunities.
Hmm.
It's up to us to be open to those opportunities and to work together to build a future that's good for everyone.
Well said. I think that about wraps up our deep dive for today.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us. It's been a
Okay.
great conversation.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive is giving you something to think about and some new perspectives on, this crazy world we live in. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.